In the pre-dawn darkness of a British airfield in late 1944, something impossible was happening. A sentry on patrol noticed the familiar silhouette of a B-17 Flying Fortress taxiing toward the runway. Nothing unusual about that, except this bomber wasn't scheduled to fly. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the aircraft was already airborne, disappearing into the night sky. But it wasn't heading west toward Germany. It was heading east, piloted by Luftwaffe officers who had just stolen one of America's most powerful bombers. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the work of Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's most secretive squadron, a unit so classified that most German pilots didn't even know it existed. While the world knew about dogfights between Spitfires and Messerschmitts, KG-200 was fighting a different kind of war. They didn't just shoot down Allied aircraft, they stole them. Then they flew them deep behind enemy lines, conducting espionage missions while disguised as the very forces they were fighting against. Imagine the audacity. German pilots learning to operate American and British bombers, memorizing foreign instruments, mastering enemy procedures, and then flying those stolen aircraft through Allied airspace, where one wrong radio call could mean instant death from friendly fire. These weren't just pilots. They were thieves, spies, and technical experts rolled into one, operating in the shadows of the greatest air war in history. Their missions were so secret that even today, many details remain classified. This is their story. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis. Allied bombers were pounding German cities with increasing impunity, and the technological advantage that had once belonged to Germany was slipping away. The Me-262 jet fighter showed promise, but it wouldn't be ready in time. German High Command needed intelligence detailed. Technical intelligence about Allied aircraft capabilities, vulnerabilities, and operational procedures. They needed it fast, and they needed it from the inside. The answer came in the form of Kampfgeschwader 200, officially activated in February 1944 under the command of Oberstleutnant Werner Bombach, one of Germany's most decorated bomber pilots. Unlike conventional Luftwaffe units, KG-200 wasn't designed for traditional combat. Its mission portfolio read like something from a spy thriller: long-range reconnaissance, agent insertion behind enemy lines, radar and radio jamming, and most audaciously, the acquisition and operation of enemy aircraft. The unit drew from the absolute elite of the Luftwaffe. Pilots selected for KG-200 needed more than exceptional flying skills. They required technical expertise to operate unfamiliar aircraft systems, linguistic abilities to understand enemy manuals, and radio communications, nerves of steel to fly missions, where capture meant certain execution as a spy, and above all, absolute discretion. Security around KG-200 was paranoid even by wartime standards. Pilots were forbidden from discussing their missions with family or even other Luftwaffe personnel. The unit operated from dispersed airfields, often using hangars separated from regular squadrons. Training was exhaustive and unconventional. Pilots studied captured Allied aircraft manuals translated into German, memorizing everything from engine startup procedures to emergency protocols. They practiced on whatever Allied aircraft had been shot down relatively intact or captured during ground operations. A B-17 Flying Fortress cockpit bore little resemblance to a Heinkel He-111. American instruments used different units of measurement. Radio frequencies and call signs had to be memorized perfectly. One mistake, one hesitation, and the mission would end in disaster. The historical context made KG-200's formation desperately necessary. By late 1944, Germany had lost air supremacy over Western Europe. Allied fighters roamed freely, shooting down anything with a German cross. Traditional reconnaissance was becoming suicidal. But an Allied bomber flying through Allied-controlled airspace? That could go anywhere, see anything, and return home safely if the deception held. The squadron's existence was compartmentalized to an extreme degree. Different units within KG-200 handled different mission types, and pilots from one section often didn't know what the others were doing. Some flew long-range reconnaissance missions to Africa and the Middle East in modified Ju 290 seconds. Others dropped agents and supplies to resistance movements, both real ones working for Germany and fake ones created to sow confusion. And then there were the specialists, the ones who flew the stolen planes. The airfields dotting the English countryside in newly liberated France in 1944 were hubs of organized chaos. Dozens of heavy bombers crowded onto hardstands, surrounded by fuel trucks, ammunition carts, and maintenance crews working around the clock. The sheer scale of Allied air operations created both security and vulnerability. A typical American bomber base in England housed hundreds of aircraft and thousands of personnel. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds sat in long rows, some being prepped for the next day's mission, others grounded for repairs, and still others simply waiting. Security focused primarily on preventing sabotage and protecting classified equipment. Sentries patrolled the perimeter, but once inside the fence line, a person in the right uniform could move relatively freely. This was the gap KG-200 learned to exploit. Allied security doctrine didn't account for the possibility of theft. Why would it? German commandos infiltrating an airfield to destroy planes made sense. But stealing a four-engine bomber and flying it back to Germany? The idea seemed absurd. It required not just getting onto the base undetected, but also possessing the technical knowledge to start and operate a complex aircraft, the navigation skills to find one's way back to German-held territory in darkness, and the linguistic ability to bluff through any radio challenges. No one thought the Germans could pull it off. The vulnerability increased with damaged aircraft. Bombers that limped back from missions with mechanical problems were often left on auxiliary airfields or remote hardstands while awaiting parts or repairs. These became prime targets. A damaged B-17 sitting alone, deemed non-operational by the base commander, might be watched less carefully than aircraft ready for combat. According to veteran accounts, some sentries grew complacent, their patrols becoming predictable as the months wore on without incident. Night operations created additional opportunities. During a mission launch, dozens of bombers would taxi and take off in sequence, their engines drowning out other sounds. In the darkness and confusion, one additional aircraft joining the takeoff queue might not be noticed until too late. Maintenance crews working overnight became accustomed to seeing aircraft move around the field. A bomber taxiing at 3 a.m. might be heading for an engine test or being repositioned. Unless someone specifically checked the flight schedule, it wouldn't trigger immediate alarm. The Allies also faced a documentation challenge. With hundreds of aircraft constantly rotating through bases, some arriving for repairs, others being transferred between units, new deliveries coming from the States tracking every individual plane in real time was difficult. A bomber reported as undergoing maintenance might actually be missing for hours before anyone connected the dots. Geography played a role too. Some forward airfields in newly liberated France sat relatively close to German lines. A stolen aircraft could reach friendly territory in under an hour of flying time, well before a comprehensive search could be organized. The confusion of war, with constantly shifting front lines and communication difficulties between Allied units, provided cover that peacetime conditions would never allow. The first successful theft of an American heavy bomber by KG-200 occurred in the late summer of 1944, though exact dates remain classified or lost to history. According to pieced-together accounts from both Allied and German sources, the target was a B-17G flying fortress that had made an emergency landing at a forward airfield in France. The bomber had suffered flak damage over Germany and couldn't maintain altitude to return to England. Its pilot had coaxed it to a newly captured American airfield near the French coast, landing with one engine completely dead and another running rough. The crew evacuated, grateful to be alive, and the aircraft was left on a remote hardstand to await an assessment team. That's when German intelligence took notice. A French resistance member working for the Germans there where more than history often acknowledges reported the damaged bomber's location. KG-200 planners saw their opportunity. The aircraft was isolated, the airfield was still being organized, and with proper timing, a theft was feasible. A four-man team was assembled, 2 pilots qualified on American aircraft, a flight engineer who had studied B-17 systems extensively, and a navigator who knew the route back to German territory. They infiltrated through the front lines on the night of September 12th, moving through a contested sector where both sides conducted patrols but neither had firm control. According to accounts that may be somewhat dramatized, they reached the airfield perimeter around 11:45 p.m., cutting through a fence section that wasn't yet properly guarded. The team wore a mixture of civilian clothes and Allied uniforms, scavenged from various sources, a dangerous choice, as capture in enemy uniform meant execution as a spy. At 1:30 a.m., they reached the B-17, The aircraft sat in darkness, seemingly forgotten. The flight engineer climbed aboard first, using a flashlight sparingly to assess the damage. The engines were cold, and the electrical systems were shut down. Working in near-total darkness to avoid detection, he began the pre-flight sequence from memory, his hands finding controls he'd only practiced on captured aircraft back in Germany. The biggest concern was the damaged engines. Would they even start? At 2:15 a.m., the team made their decision. The lead pilot, whose name remains unknown, climbed into the left seat and began the engine start sequence. The number 3 engine, undamaged, coughed to life with a roar that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Then number 4. So far, so good. Number 2. The rough-running engine, started but ran unevenly, the propeller visible in the moonlight as it struggled to maintain rhythm. The number 1 engine, damaged by flak, wouldn't turn over at all. The pilot faced a critical decision. Could a B-17 take off and fly on 3 engines? The manual said yes, but only barely, and only if the aircraft wasn't heavily loaded. This one was nearly empty, no bombs, no ammunition, minimal fuel. At 2:35 a.m., with one engine windmilling dead and another running rough, the pilot released the brakes. According to plausibly dramatized accounts, his hands were sweating inside his gloves as the bomber began to roll. The B-17 gained speed slowly, too slowly. The runway was shorter than the training fields back home. At the far end, darkness and trees waited. The engineer called out airspeeds in accented English, reading instruments he'd memorized from photographs and manuals. 70, 80, 90. The pilot pulled back on the yoke. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the massive bomber lifted off, clearing the trees at the runway's end by what the crew later estimated as less than 20 feet. They turned east immediately, flying low to avoid radar. Behind them, the airfield remained dark and quiet. The theft wouldn't be discovered until the morning shift arrived. By then, the B-17 would be safely hidden in a camouflaged hangar deep in Germany, ready to be studied, tested, and eventually flown on missions against its former owners. Operating a stolen Allied bomber wasn't just about mechanical knowledge, it was about thinking like an Allied crew while being hunted by both sides. The pilots of KG-200 who flew these missions entered a psychological no-man's land where every aircraft in the sky was a potential threat. The immediate challenge was the aircraft itself. A B-17 Flying Fortress cockpit was a maze of unfamiliar instruments, all labeled in English, using American units of measurement. Altitude in feet, not meters. Airspeed in miles per hour, not kilometers. Fuel quantity in gallons. Engine instruments marked with different color codes. Radio frequencies on different bands. Every dial, every switch, every procedure had to be relearned. German pilots trained on these systems before missions, but training on the ground was vastly different from operating the aircraft in flight, especially in combat conditions. According to veteran accounts that may contain dramatized elements, one pilot described his first time flying a stolen B-24 Liberator as like trying to drive a car while reading the manual in a foreign language during a storm. The control responses were different, heavier, less precise than German aircraft. The engines sounded different. Even the smell inside the cockpit was foreign. Navigation presented its own problems. German pilots knew their own territory and had learned Allied routes through intelligence briefings. But flying a bomber that looked Allied meant potential interception by German fighters who might not ask questions before shooting. KG-200 aircraft were supposed to transmit coded identification signals, but in the chaos of combat, mistakes happened. At least one stolen B-17 was reportedly attacked by a Luftwaffe night fighter whose pilot didn't recognize the special markings. The reverse problem was even more dangerous. Flying through Allied airspace in an Allied bomber meant blending in perfectly. This required knowing current radio procedures, recognition signals, and formation protocols. Allied intelligence regularly changed code words and challenge response sequences to prevent exactly this type of infiltration. A single wrong response to a radio challenge would trigger an immediate fighter interception. Some missions involved flying the stolen aircraft in broad daylight alongside actual Allied formations. The audacity was breathtaking. A German-piloted B-17 would join up with an American bomber stream, matching their altitude and spacing, flying in formation as they penetrated deep into German territory. While the real American bombers prepared to drop their loads on German cities, the imposter would be photographing German defenses, noting Allied tactics, and collecting intelligence. The psychological strain was immense. These pilots knew that at any moment an Allied gunner might notice something wrong, a slightly off position, an unusual maneuver, anything that didn't fit the pattern. They also knew that if they were shot down over Germany, their own flak batteries wouldn't hesitate. And if they survived to be captured, they would likely be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. Emergency situations multiplied the danger. When a genuine mechanical problem occurred, and they did, frequently, given that many stolen aircraft were already damaged, the pilot had to solve it using Allied procedures and Allied equipment. One account, possibly embellished but plausible, describes a KG-200 pilot whose stolen B-17 lost an engine over the English Channel. Unable to maintain altitude, he faced a terrible choice: crash land in England and face capture, or attempt to reach the French coast on failing engines. He chose to press on, the bomber descending steadily, engine temperature gauges climbing into the red. He crossed the coast at less than 500 feet, the aircraft shuddering from the damaged engine, and managed to set it down on a German-held field with the landing gear only partially extended. The bomber was destroyed, but the crew survived to fly another day. These weren't just test flights. KG-200 flew operational missions in stolen aircraft, each one a high-wire act where the slightest mistake meant death. The psychological toll was severe. Several pilots reportedly requested transfer out of the unit after only a few missions, unable to handle the constant tension of flying aircraft where you couldn't trust anyone, not even your own side. Once KG-200 had perfected the art of operating Allied aircraft, these stolen bombers became platforms for some of the war's most daring intelligence operations. Flying deep behind enemy lines in a captured B-17 or B-24, German crews could accomplish what traditional reconnaissance aircraft could never achieve: complete freedom of movement through Allied airspace. The primary use of stolen bombers was photographic reconnaissance. A German-operated B-17 could fly over Allied supply depots, airfields, and troop concentrations in broad daylight, cameras hidden in the bomb bay, capturing detailed images. From the ground, it was just another Allied bomber. Allied fighters ignored it. Anti-aircraft batteries didn't fire. The bomber would complete its photographic run, then turn east and head home, carrying intelligence worth more than a successful bombing raid. These reconnaissance missions revealed crucial information. The Germans photographed the buildup for the invasion of southern France, identifying concentration points and probable landing beaches. They tracked Allied aircraft numbers and types at various airfields, helping Luftwaffe planners understand the true scale of Allied air superiority. They identified supply routes and logistical bottlenecks. All of this while flying an aircraft that, to all observers, appeared to belong exactly where it was. Agent insertion was another specialty. KG-200 used stolen Allied bombers to drop German agents behind Allied lines, particularly in France and the Low Countries. A B-17 flying over occupied France at night wouldn't draw attention. The Allies were conducting their own resistance support operations. The German bomber would drop its agents with supplies, sometimes landing on clandestine airstrips, then return to Germany. Some of these agents were intended to infiltrate resistance movements and report back. Others had sabotage missions. According to accounts that include some plausibly fictionalized details, one such mission nearly ended in disaster when a stolen B-24 Liberator developed engine trouble while approaching a drop zone in Belgium. The pilot was at 8,000 feet, preparing to drop 2 agents, when the number 2 engine began losing oil pressure. The engineer watched the gauge drop, knowing that engine seizure was imminent. They had minutes, maybe less. The pilot made the decision to continue the drop despite the emergency. The agents parachuted out at 8:30 p.m., their supplies following moments later. Then the pilot turned for home, the damaged engine already trailing smoke. He shut it down at 8:35 p.m., feathering the propeller to reduce drag. The B-24 could fly on 3 engines, but they were still deep in Allied territory, and the disabled engine was visible evidence that something was wrong. The crew descended to 2,000 feet, hoping to avoid radar detection and enemy fighters. They flew east through the night, the damaged engine occasionally backfiring despite being shut down, each bang like a signal flare announcing their presence. They crossed into German territory at 10:15 p.m., finally safe, and landed at their base with minimal fuel remaining. The mission was recorded as a success, but it had been too close. Some missions involved electronic intelligence gathering. Stolen bombers carried German radio and radar monitoring equipment. flying close to Allied formations to intercept communications and map radar coverage. This information helped German planners understand Allied command and control systems, identify radio frequencies, and locate radar installations. It was dangerous work. Getting too close to an Allied formation risked visual identification, but staying too far away meant weak signals and poor intelligence. There were also psychological operations. KG-200 occasionally flew stolen bombers on harassment missions, dropping propaganda leaflets or small bombs on Allied positions. The goal wasn't military damage, but confusion and paranoia. If Allied soldiers couldn't trust their own aircraft, it created uncertainty and fear. Some accounts suggest that stolen bombers made low passes over Allied airfields at night, dropping nothing but making their presence known, a reminder that the Germans could reach anywhere. The cumulative effect of these operations was significant. KG-200's intelligence contributions helped Germany maintain situational awareness, even as the Luftwaffe lost control of the skies. The stolen aircraft program demonstrated that technological and tactical innovation could partially offset numerical inferiority. However, by late 1944, the strategic situation was beyond salvage. No amount of clever espionage could overcome the massive material advantage the Allies possessed. Not every KG-200 mission succeeded. The unit's casualty rate was higher than conventional bomber squadrons, and for good reason. These pilots operated without backup, without support, and often without anyone even knowing they were airborne. When things went wrong, they went catastrophically wrong. One of the earliest failures occurred during a reconnaissance mission over southern England in October 1944. A stolen B-17, carrying photographic equipment and a four-man crew, was flying a carefully planned route over Allied airfields when it was challenged by radio. The procedure was routine. Allied air traffic controllers regularly checked in with aircraft transiting their zones. But this time, the code word had been changed that morning, something German intelligence hadn't intercepted. The KG-200 radio operator, highly trained and fluent in English, responded with the previous day's code. There was a pause. Then the controller requested confirmation of the aircraft's mission orders. The German crew knew they were compromised. Within minutes, 4 RAF Spitfires were vectored to intercept. The B-17 pilot pushed the throttles forward and dove for cloud cover, but the Spitfires were faster. According to accounts of the engagement, one pilot allegedly whispered a prayer as anti-aircraft tracers zipped past, though whether this detail is genuine or added for dramatic effect remains unclear. The B-17 took hits in 2 engines before reaching the clouds. The pilot managed to evade the fighters temporarily, but the damage was severe. He turned east, trying to reach German-held territory, but the bomber was losing altitude steadily. They crossed the English Channel at barely 1,000 feet, the crew jettisoning everything movable to stay airborne. They almost made it. The B-17 crashed in the surf off the French coast, just short of the beach. 2 crew members drowned. The other 2 were captured and, after interrogation revealed their unit, were never heard from again. Other failures came from mechanical problems. Stolen aircraft were often already damaged, and even those in good condition were being operated beyond their maintenance schedules. A B-24, Liberator taking off on a night reconnaissance mission in November 1944, suffered a catastrophic engine failure just after becoming airborne. The aircraft had been stolen from an airfield in France only days earlier and hadn't been fully inspected. At 11:50 p.m., as the bomber climbed through 500 feet, the No. 3 engine exploded. Metal fragments punctured the wing fuel tanks, and fire spread rapidly. The pilot had seconds to decide. He couldn't turn back. The airfield was German-held but small, and a burning bomber on approach would crash into hangars and facilities. He couldn't parachute. They were too low, and the aircraft was already breaking up. According to possibly dramatized accounts, he aimed the bomber at an empty field and rode it down, the cockpit filling with smoke. The B-24 hit hard, cartwheeled, and disintegrated. Miraculously, 3 of the 6 crew members survived, pulled from the wreckage by ground personnel who had watched the horror unfold. Some missions failed due to simple bad luck. A stolen B-17 on a reconnaissance mission over Allied lines was flying through broken clouds when it emerged directly in front of an American fighter patrol. The fighters hadn't been looking for the bomber. They were on a different mission entirely, but suddenly found themselves alongside what appeared to be a lone, unescorted B-17. Something about it seemed wrong. Perhaps the formation position, perhaps the unusual hour. perhaps just instinct. The fighter leader called the bomber on radio to identify itself. The German crew, caught completely off guard, fumbled the response. The fighters opened fire immediately, hitting the cockpit. The B-17 went down in flames. All crew lost. Weather caused its share of failures too. A mission in December 1944 required a stolen B-24 to photograph Allied positions before a planned German offensive. The weather forecast called for marginal conditions, low clouds but flyable. In reality, the crew encountered thick fog and icing conditions. Without proper navigation aids and unfamiliar with the Allied radio beacon system they couldn't safely use, they became lost. The bomber wandered through deteriorating weather for over an hour before the pilot, recognizing they were nearly out of fuel, attempted an emergency landing at what he thought was a German airfield. It was Belgian, held by British forces. The bomber came in with gear down, clearly in distress, and was allowed to land. The crew was immediately surrounded and captured. The intelligence loss was severe. The aircraft contained cameras with exposed film of German positions and a codebook for radio communications. Perhaps the most tragic failure came during the largest attempted operation, an ambitious plan to steal multiple aircraft in a single night. One of the target bombers appeared perfect, a B-17, sitting alone on a hard stand, undergoing what appeared to be minor repairs. The German infiltration team reached it without incident at 2 a.m. They began the startup sequence. Engines 1 and 2 fired normally, but when engine 3 started, there was a horrible grinding sound. Unknown to the Germans, that engine had been deliberately disabled, its propeller shaft was damaged, and starting it caused catastrophic internal failure. Metal fragments tore through the engine housing. Fuel lines ruptured. Fire erupted. The team had seconds to escape. They ran from the aircraft as flames engulfed the engine nacelle and spread to the wing. The explosion came at 2:08 a.m., lighting up the airfield like daylight and triggering every alarm on the base. The infiltration team scattered, but 2 were captured within hours. The others vanished into the night, their fate unknown. These failures taught KG-200 hard lessons. They tightened their aircraft inspection procedures, improved their training on Allied radio protocols, and became more selective about which aircraft to target. But the fundamental reality remained. They were operating on the edge of possibility, where skill and preparation could only reduce risk, never eliminate it. The most ambitious operation in KG-200's history occurred on the night of the 23rd of November 1944, targeting an American bomber base in northeastern France. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. Steal 3 B-17 flying fortresses in a single coordinated action, then fly them back to Germany before the alarm could be raised and defenses organized. Planning for the operation took weeks. German intelligence had identified the target airfield through reconnaissance and reports from agents. The base housed elements of the 8th Air Force, with approximately 40 B-17 seconds dispersed across various hardstands. Crucially, several aircraft were undergoing repairs in a remote section of the field, separated from the main operations area. These became the primary targets. The German planners faced extraordinary challenges. Stealing 1 aircraft required skill and luck. Stealing 3 simultaneously meant coordinating multiple teams, all moving in darkness through hostile territory, all depending on split-second timing. If one team was discovered early, the entire operation would collapse. They needed the element of surprise to last long enough for all 3 bombers to get airborne. 3 infiltration teams were assembled, each consisting of a pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and navigator. 9 additional personnel provided security and technical support. The teams trained together for 2 weeks, practicing on captured B-17 seconds, until they could perform a cold start in complete darkness in under 20 minutes. They memorized the target airfield layout from aerial photographs, identifying patrol routes and guard positions. The infiltration began at 9:30 p.m. The teams crossed the front lines separately, moving through a lightly held sector where both sides conducted active patrols but permanent positions were sparse. They wore civilian clothing with concealed weapons, carrying forged papers identifying them as French laborers. If stopped by patrols, the plan was to bluff their way through. If that failed, they would fight. All 3 teams reached the assembly point, an abandoned farm building 2 kilometers from the airfield. By 11:45 p.m., so far, everything was proceeding as planned. They rested briefly, changed into stolen American uniforms again, making them spies subject to execution if captured, and reviewed final instructions. At 12:30 a.m., they moved toward the airfield. The perimeter fence at this section was new barbed wire but poorly guarded. According to accounts that may be somewhat dramatized, a sentry was reportedly smoking a cigarette on the far side of a hangar, his patrol route taking him away from the infiltration point. The teams cut through the fence at 1:05 a.m. and slipped onto the field. The three target aircraft sat in darkness. Targets Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, designated by their positions on the hardstand. Alpha Team reached their B-17 first, a veteran bomber with over 30 mission markers painted on its nose. The crew chief climbed aboard at 1:15 a.m. and began his inspection. To his alarm, one tire was flat, a potentially mission-ending problem. But the aircraft was light enough that taking off on 3 main gear tires, plus the tail wheel, was theoretically possible, though extremely dangerous. Bravo Team found their aircraft in better condition, minor flak damage to the tail section, but all systems appeared operational. They began pre-flight immediately, working methodically through the checklist. The flight engineer discovered that someone had removed several inspection panels to access interior systems. He replaced them hastily, knowing that loose panels at high speed could cause structural failure. Charlie Team had the worst luck. Their B-17 showed evidence of significant engine work. The No. 2 engine had been partially disassembled, with tools still sitting on the wing. The pilot, faced with a critical decision, chose to abandon that aircraft and move to the secondary target, a B-17 sitting 30 meters away. This meant precious time, lost time they didn't have. At 1:45 a.m., Alpha Team began engine start. The noise seemed impossibly loud, but the airfield was large, and bomber engines running at night weren't uncommon. Maintenance crews often performed engine tests. The engines caught and settled into a rough idle. Bravo Team started their engines at 1:48 a.m. Charlie Team, still moving to their secondary target, was falling behind schedule. The plan called for all 3 aircraft to taxi simultaneously at 2 a.m., overwhelming any response by presenting multiple targets. But Charlie Team wasn't ready. The mission commander, aboard Alpha, faced his decision point. Wait for Charlie and risk discovery, or proceed with 2 aircraft. According to plausibly dramatized accounts, he allegedly made a quick radio call on a prearranged frequency. 2 birds fly. The decision was made. Alpha and Bravo began taxiing at 2:03 a.m. The bombers rolled slowly along the taxiway, their external lights off, navigation entirely by moonlight. Behind them, Charlie Team was frantically completing their pre-flight, the pilot working through the checklist at double speed. They started engines at 2:06 a.m., knowing they were dangerously behind schedule. The first alert came at 2:08 a.m. A ground crew member, preparing another bomber for an early morning mission, noticed the 2 B-17 seconds taxiing without authorization. He reported it to the operations tower. Confusion followed. Were these authorized maintenance runs? The duty officer began checking flight schedules. Precious seconds ticked by. Alpha reached the runway threshold at 2:10 a.m. Without waiting for clearance, the pilot advanced throttles and began his takeoff roll. The B-17, with a flat tire, shuddered and pulled to one side. The pilot fought the controls, keeping the aircraft centerline through pure strength. At 85 miles per hour, the tire disintegrated completely. The bomber swerved violently, but the pilot had already reached takeoff speed. He pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted off at 2:11 a.m., the damaged landing gear slowly retracting. Bravo followed at 2:12 a.m., a textbook takeoff. Behind them, Charlie was still taxiing, and now the entire airfield was awakening. Alarm sirens began wailing at 2:13 a.m. Floodlights snapped on. A jeep raced toward the taxiway to block Charlie's path. The Charlie pilot had one chance. The taxiway was long and relatively straight. He pushed the throttles to full power while still on the ground, using the taxiway itself for his takeoff run. The B-17 accelerated, the pursuing jeep falling behind. At 2:15 a.m., doing barely 60 miles per hour, far below normal takeoff speed, the pilot pulled back hard on the controls. The bomber staggered into the air, wallowing dangerously on the edge of a stall, clearing the boundary fence by less than 10 feet. All 3 aircraft turned east immediately, climbing hard. Behind them, the airfield erupted in chaos. Fighter alert aircraft were scrambled at 2:18 a.m., but in the darkness and confusion, vectoring them to the stolen bombers proved difficult. Allied radar showed 3 aircraft heading east, but they looked like any other bomber flight, no reason to assume they were hostile. The German crews navigated using dead reckoning and radio beacons, staying low to avoid radar as much as possible. At 3:45 a.m., they crossed into German-held territory. At 4:30 a.m., all 3 bombers landed safely at a Luftwaffe base in southwestern Germany, their crews exhausted but triumphant. The operation was KG-200's greatest success. 3 Allied heavy bombers, stolen in a single night, flown to Germany, and added to the unit's collection of enemy aircraft. The intelligence value was immense. The aircraft were thoroughly examined, their systems analyzed, and their radios and electronics studied in detail. But it was also the beginning of the end. The theft was so brazen, so impossible to ignore, that it triggered a comprehensive Allied security review. The era of easy targets was over. The triple theft of the 23rd of November 1944 sent shockwaves through Allied command. Losing 3 heavy bombers in a single night, not to combat, but to theft, was humiliating and deeply concerning. If the Germans could steal B-17 seconds from a supposedly secure airfield, what else were they capable of? The investigation began immediately. Military police interviewed everyone on duty that night, attempting to piece together how the infiltration succeeded. Security camera footage, where it existed, was reviewed. The cut fence section was examined. Patrol logs were scrutinized. What emerged was a picture of systematic security failures. The airfield perimeter was too large to patrol effectively with available personnel. Guard positions were predictable, rotating on fixed schedules that anyone watching for a few nights could memorize. Aircraft sitting in remote maintenance areas weren't under direct observation. Perhaps most damning, there was no secondary verification system for aircraft movements at night. If a bomber started its engines and began taxiing, ground personnel assumed it was authorized. Within a week, new security protocols were implemented across all Allied airfields in Europe. Perimeter patrols were randomized and reinforced. Aircraft in maintenance status had their batteries removed and control surfaces locked. A new verification system required tower authorization before any aircraft could taxi, backed by cross-checking against current flight schedules. Sentries received training on infiltration tactics and were reminded that sabotage and theft were real threats, not theoretical ones. But the security improvements came too late to prevent all consequences of the thefts. The 3 stolen B-17 seconds were already in German hands. Being thoroughly analyzed, German engineers discovered weaknesses in the aircraft's defensive systems, identifying blind spots in the defensive gun coverage that Luftwaffe pilots could exploit. They mapped the electronic systems, understanding Allied radio frequencies and identification procedures. They studied the bomb sites and navigation equipment, gaining insights into Allied bombing accuracy. More troubling was the realization that other thefts had likely occurred without Allied knowledge. A comprehensive audit of aircraft across all European bases revealed discrepancies, bombers listed as transferred or scrapped due to damage that couldn't be fully accounted for. Some may have been legitimate administrative errors in the chaos of war. Others might have been successful KG-200 operations that went completely undetected. Intelligence analysts began reviewing previous incidents with new suspicion. An unidentified B-17 spotted flying unusual patterns over Allied positions in October, possibly a stolen aircraft. A bomber that appeared on radar heading the wrong direction? Maybe German-operated. Reports from agents indicated that the Germans had a substantial collection of Allied aircraft at various Luftwaffe test facilities. Not all of them could have been shot down and captured. The psychological impact on Allied personnel was significant. Bomber crews already faced terrifying odds on every mission: flak, fighters, mechanical failure, weather. Now they had to wonder if that B-17 flying in formation beside them might be enemy-operated, photographing their tactics and reporting their positions. Ground crews became suspicious of anything unusual, reporting incidents that previously would have been ignored. Allied counterintelligence took aggressive action. Radio frequencies and challenge codes were changed more frequently. Recognition signals became more sophisticated, incorporating responses that required knowledge of current American slang or cultural references that German pilots, no matter how well trained, might not know. Fighter patrols were briefed to treat any B-17 or B-24, flying alone or in unusual patterns, as potentially hostile, investigating before assuming friendly identification. The most effective countermeasure, however, was simply awareness. Once Allied personnel understood that aircraft theft was possible, they watched for it. The element of surprise that had enabled KG-200's successes evaporated. By early 1945, attempting to steal an Allied bomber from a secure airfield had become nearly suicidal. KG-200's stolen aircraft program, while dramatic and audacious, had mixed strategic impact. The intelligence gained was valuable, but whether it significantly altered the course of the air war remains debatable among historians. The technical intelligence proved most useful. German engineers learned much from examining captured B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds in detail. They discovered that American bombers, while tough and reliable, had specific vulnerabilities. The B-17's oxygen system could be disrupted with specific attack angles. The B-24's fuel system was more vulnerable to incendiary ammunition than previously thought. The defensive gun positions had blind spots that skilled fighter pilots could exploit. This knowledge was disseminated to Luftwaffe fighter units, potentially improving their effectiveness against American bomber formations. However, by late 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was being systematically destroyed by Allied fighters and fuel shortages. Better tactics couldn't overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority the Allies possessed. The intelligence was useful, but not decisive. The psychological and propaganda value was perhaps greater than the tactical value. The mere fact that Germany could operate deep behind Allied lines in captured aircraft demonstrated that the Luftwaffe, despite being on the defensive, still possessed elite capabilities. It provided a small morale boost to German forces and civilian population at a time when good news was scarce. For the Allies, the stolen aircraft program created paranoia and forced resource allocation toward improved security. Personnel and equipment devoted to guarding against infiltration and theft were resources not available for offensive operations. The security improvements implemented after the November 1944 triple theft required additional manpower at every bomber base in Europe. This was an indirect victory for KG-200, forcing the enemy to expend resources defending against your operations, even if the operations themselves become harder to execute. From a historical perspective, KG-200's stolen aircraft missions represent a unique chapter in aerial warfare. Never before, and arguably never since, has a military force systematically stolen and operated enemy aircraft on operational missions in such numbers. The technical skill required was extraordinary. The audacity was breathtaking. The risks were enormous. The program also demonstrated the value of unconventional warfare approaches. While Germany's conventional Luftwaffe forces were being overwhelmed by superior Allied numbers, a small elite unit using captured equipment achieved penetration and intelligence gathering that traditional methods couldn't accomplish. This lesson wasn't lost on post-war military planners. The specific intelligence about Allied aircraft helped German aviation designers in the few months remaining before the war's end. Insights from captured B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds informed late-war German aircraft development, though most of these designs never progressed beyond prototypes before Germany's surrender. Some of this knowledge, particularly regarding American electronics and radar systems, proved valuable to both Soviet and Allied intelligence services in the post-war period. Perhaps most significantly, KG-200's operations influenced post-war aviation security protocols. The vulnerability exposed by the aircraft thefts led to fundamental changes in how military aircraft are secured, tracked, and authorized for flight. Modern military bases implement multiple layers of security, specifically designed to prevent the type of infiltration KG-200 executed. The lessons learned in 1944 continue to shape military security practices today. Kampfgeschwader 200's legacy exists in the shadows of World War II history. While the great aerial battles, the Battle of Britain, the strategic bombing campaign, the fighter sweeps over Germany are well documented and celebrated, KG-200's quiet war of infiltration and deception remains relatively unknown. This obscurity isn't accidental. Much of KG-200's operational records were destroyed in the final days of the war, either by retreating German forces or lost in the chaos of collapse. Surviving personnel, facing potential war crimes charges for operating in enemy uniforms, had little incentive to document their activities. Allied forces, embarrassed by the security failures the unit exposed, didn't publicize the thefts. The result is that many details remain classified or lost, known only through fragmentary records and occasional veteran accounts. What we do know paints a picture of exceptional skill operating under impossible pressure. The pilots who flew stolen Allied bombers were among the most capable aviators of the war. They had to master unfamiliar aircraft systems, navigate hostile airspace, blend in with enemy formations, and return safely, all while knowing that capture meant almost certain execution. Many didn't return. Those who did carried memories of missions they could never fully discuss, even decades after the war ended. The strategic significance of KG-200's stolen aircraft program can be debated, but the human dimension is clear. These were men who volunteered for missions with survival odds far worse than conventional combat operations. They operated not for glory, their work was secret, but from duty, skill, and perhaps the simple human desire to accomplish the seemingly impossible. In the broader context of World War II, KG-200 represents Germany's desperate attempt to compensate for material inferiority through innovation and audacity. By late 1944, the war was lost. No amount of clever operations could overcome the massive industrial and numerical advantages the Allies possessed. But KG-200 tried anyway, executing missions that required extraordinary courage and skill. The story of Germans flying stolen Allied bombers through Allied airspace, conducting espionage missions while disguised as the enemy, sounds like fiction. That it actually happened, multiple times, successfully, speaks to both the audacity of the operatives and the chaos of total war. In the fog of global conflict, with millions of people moving across continents and thousands of aircraft filling the skies, the impossible occasionally became possible. Today, the few remaining B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds fly at air shows, carefully maintained reminders of the Allied bomber offensive. When they pass overhead, engines roaring, few spectators know that some of their wartime sisters flew under very different markings, piloted by men who had stolen them from their rightful owners. The bombers themselves are gone, scrapped, or destroyed decades ago. But the story endures a reminder that in war, innovation and audacity sometimes matter as much as numbers and firepower. KG-200's stolen aircraft program was ultimately a footnote in the broader air war, but what a remarkable footnote. It demonstrated that even when facing overwhelming odds, human ingenuity and courage could achieve penetrations that seemed theoretically impossible. The pilots who flew these missions operated at the absolute edge of possibility, where skill, nerve, and luck combined to create moments of success before the inevitable tide of war swept over them. Their legacy isn't monuments or celebrations. It's in the security protocols that still govern military airfields, in the careful tracking systems that account for every aircraft, in the lesson that the impossible is sometimes merely the very difficult, waiting for someone audacious enough to attempt it. The men of KG-200 were that audacious. Whether they were right to serve the cause they fought for is a separate question. But their skill and courage, operating in the shadows of history's greatest conflict, deserves to be remembered.